Hi everyone. Sorry we won't be able to meet today in our workshop session, but I'm recording the presentation that I was going to do anyway, and I hope this is helpful. But please let me know if you have any questions about this presentation. Obviously, I am contactable via email. So this presentation, we're going to look at some of the considerations that are important when you are designing your learning program. Up until now, we've talked about all the preparatory stuff, what is the purpose, what is your rationale and justification, what is an assessment strategy, what is the teaching and learning strategy. And today we're going to look at actually, all right, how do we get to the nitty-gritty of designing the learning program, and in particular looking at the learning outcomes and assessment criteria. Just to recap, we have so far spoken about the relational model of curriculum design at program level. This is a slide that I showed in the last presentation we did in the third workshop, where we looked at both the program level and subject level relational considerations. And today we're going to look more at the subject level ones. So thinking about all the structural considerations you needed to take into effect initially, and then how this feeds into the purpose statement of your qualification, and then your program design, and then today, as I said, exit level outcomes that we're going to be looking at. And we're also going to be looking briefly at the learning outcomes for each subject of the program. So if we're thinking about the subject, what is going to make up your learning program, before we really even get there, we need to say, all right, what are the broad knowledge areas that you'll need to include to achieve your purpose? So going right back to your purpose statement, what is this qualification setting out to achieve? What are the broad knowledge areas? And then arising from that, what are going to be the subjects and the subject areas you'll need to include? Very important, how will the subjects relate to each other? So in other words, if you want to achieve a certain purpose, the subject areas, the content, the knowledge areas need to be integrated in a certain way to achieve that. So how are the subjects going to interrelate to each other? It's not just a basket full of arbitrary subjects that you put together. They need to really, really speak to each other. And how their credit values are going to be decided, and how will these reflect on the purpose of the qualification. So this is all a whole integrated conceptualization of it. So how many notional hours, how do the credit values translate into the notional learning hours? And then how will this align with your program delivery strategy? So if it's going to be a fully contact, on campus, lectures only, or is it going to be a delivery strategy going to be more blended learning with some perhaps block sessions and individual learning in between? And that of course very much depends on the type of your qualification, what the purpose is. If it's a postgraduate diploma, so if it's a more of a postgraduate qualification, students will be expected to do a lot more independent learning than if they're doing a higher certificate, for example. So the learning program delivery strategy depends on a number of issues, and this all feeds into the credit values of subjects, how they relate to each other, how they are designed, how they fit together. Okay. So if it's a major subject, obviously it'll have many more credits assigned to it than it will if it's a specialist subject that perhaps there's only being offered on in let's say the third term. So think about that very carefully. Another issue, and we did cover this when we were looking at the teaching and learning strategy, but perhaps not quite as in quite as focused a way, is realizing that what is learned depends on how it is learned. So thinking about your teaching and learning strategy, thinking about the types of subjects, thinking about the purpose of the qualification. What is learned depends very much on how it is learned. So different learning experiences lead to different ways of knowing. For example, if you want to deliver a qualification on entrepreneurship, one of the learning activities could be around a game to do with entrepreneurship. a business game where students are actually engaged in experiencing what it is to perhaps set up a small business or to run a small business or to design a budget or whatever it is. So they will experience the learning. They will experience the relationship between the decisions they take and achieving the goals that they want, between the actions and the goals. And in a learning activity like this, they will get feedback from the rules of the game. So there'll be what we call intrinsic feedback. Just from doing it, they'll be getting feedback on how they are achieving their goals. They'll also be getting feedback from the social rules of the game. So how are they actually interacting with each other as individuals or in a team? And also from their peers. So their peers will be giving them feedback about, how they're doing. Oh, don't be so greedy. Oh, you're cheating there, whatever. So they'll be getting some extrinsic feedback from their peers, but they'll also be getting a lot of intrinsic feedback from the game itself. And if you think about it, if we want our students to become motivated to learn, the intrinsic feedback really is the most important thing. So are they getting feedback just from the learning activity itself? Is it giving them satisfaction, fulfillment, and excitement? If it is, that's a really, really strong strategy for learning. So think about how you want your students to learn. How can they experience their learning in a way that is going to motivate them to want to learn and to learn more? Another way of engaging students in learning is perhaps to give them a business case study, and maybe do this case study or engage in the business case study problem with a peer. So a small group or peer learning or whatever, a pair of students. And this will engage them in different ways of learning. So they'll be doing some academic reading and writing. They'll need to analyze the case study. They'll need to apply knowledge or even derive principled and propositional knowledge. So they'll be working with knowledge in a different way. It'll be much more overt. Whereas in doing a business game, it's much more fun and it's kind of tacit what they're learning. It's not that obvious. In this case, doing a business case study, their feedback will be much more extrinsic. So they're relying on the teacher or the lecturer to give them feedback on how well they've done. So those are two modalities of learning, but let's think of a third one that is really very intrinsic in the kind of feedback. If we want to let our students understand financial modeling, for instance, in a small business, we could give them spreadsheets that they have to manipulate in certain ways so they can engage with supply, demand, and income expenditure, profit, loss, sales trajectories, for example. And as they input certain figures or information, the spreadsheets will provide them with certain outcomes. So they'll be learning as they go along at if this, then that, if this, then that. So it'll build their knowledge of their behavior of the business as a system. And this is really intrinsic feedback that they'll get on their financial decisions that they take, rather than the extrinsic feedback from teacher. And obviously this is something that's very authentic, because if they are going to be running a small business, they will need to be doing modeling their financials in spreadsheets and things like this. So very authentic type of exercise. Relating this back to your teaching and learning strategy, relating it back to the purpose, and now thinking about your the coherence of your program. So when we are designing our programs, you need to think very much in terms of constructive alignment. We talk about constructive alignment in terms of learning outcomes and assessment criteria, but really constructive alignment is something that feeds through the entire program. So if we look at constructive alignment in terms of this diagram, for instance, the purpose and the characteristics of the qualification are very much linked to the learning objectives. They need to be very strongly linked to the learning objectives, which is what you will have as the teacher. What do you wish to achieve through your teaching and learning and through this qualification? And the learning objectives obviously have to be aligned with the learning outcomes for the students. What are the students going to learn? If you want to achieve a certain thing, how are the students going to learn this? The learning outcomes, again, are very strongly aligned with the teaching and learning strategy and delivery. So how are they going to achieve this learning? And this can be broken down into smaller learning activities. So how are they going to achieve this learning, and taking it right down to, how, looking at these previous slides, what kind of learning activities are you going to be providing? Are you going to be using digital technology, case studies, games, etc.? All right. So those would be your learning activities. And again, then, if those are going to be the learning activities, then how are you going to know if the learning outcomes have been achieved? Well, one discovers that through the assessment strategy and the assessment activities, which should very closely mimic the types of learning activities they've been engaged in. So your assessment strategy and your assessment activities are always closely modeled on what they have done in the classroom up to that point. It's not something new. It's not something that they're unfamiliar with. Okay, so constructive alignment, everything is interrelated, everything depends on everything else. And that story, that narrative, that clear golden thread has got to run throughout your documentation when you are writing this qualification up. So in your subjects, all of these considerations need to be strongly linked to each other and follow a common narrative. Okay, so how do we then now pull this together? You pull it through learning outcomes. What are learning outcomes? Be careful about the difference between an outcome, between an assessment criteria and a learning outcome. So learning outcomes and the associated assessment criteria, the AACs, define what students should know, do, and value on completion of a subject or a program. All right. So they should address the knowledge content, the skills, and the value, the ways of being in that particular profession. So that's why we had one of the activities that I asked you to do in one of the previous workshops was, what does a professional person in your field look like? And that feeds very much into what the learning outcomes and assessment criteria would be. So how do you expect these people to be? What do they need to be by the time they complete the program? Now, there are what we call exit level outcomes, and there are subject level outcomes. So exit level outcomes is what you expect the students to achieve by the end of the program, whereas subject level outcomes are obviously what you expect the students to know, be able to do, and be by the end of each particular subject. Exit level outcomes, therefore, because they're very overarching, they're densely packed statements explicitly describing the significant learning achievements at program level. So what are the significant learning achievements that are expected of the students at the program level? Whereas the associated assessment criteria, the word assessment is in there because it is talking to how are you going to know if they have achieved the learning outcomes. So how are you going to assess how the learning outcomes have been achieved at the exit level of the program? Associated assessment criteria are aligned closely to the exit level outcomes, therefore, and are statements describing the acceptable threshold standard against which the learning outcomes are assessed. So it gives detail of how the learning outcomes are going to be measured, but it also very much the standard. All right, so if we define your outcomes at the program level within a constructive alignment way, then the connections between the intended learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment tasks are intrinsically aligned and made explicit to students. And I think that's a really important thing. So this is not about how am I going to teach the course. This is how do the students understand what they are going to learn on the course. All right? And what is expected of them. Learning outcomes are for the learner. Teaching objectives are for you as the teacher. So learning outcomes focus on what and how students are to learn rather than on what topics the teacher is to teach. And it requires that an intended learning outcome specifies not only what is to be learned, but how it is to be learned and to what standard. All right? I spent a lot of time explaining something actually which is really very, very simple, but let's just see how this unpacks. And people find huge difficulty in writing learning outcomes. And it's all about the language and you thinking very deeply about the sorts of learning that is going to happen. So, a learning outcome that says demonstrate understanding of, in this case, let's say, of financial management of a small business. What do you think the student would understand by that? Demonstrate understanding of, how do I demonstrate my understanding? What would I need to do? Yeah, I understand it, but how am I going to demonstrate that to you? A much better learning outcome would be something like demonstrate an understanding of the key financial management concepts. Oh, key financial management concepts. Okay. In the analysis of small business related case studies. Okay, so the standard is going to be for this level, it's going to be just small business related case studies. I'm not going to have to go out into the workplace and go and do financial management of set of books of a large company. We're just going to be looking at small business related case studies, and I need to show how I understand financial management concepts in that particular context. So that breaks it down for the student and makes it quite contained and very clear as to what they'll need to do. Another way of writing that would be apply key concepts of financial management in the analysis of small business related case studies. But it's very well defined and very clear as to what is going to be required of the students. Just one thing to remember, that learning outcomes are not devoid of knowledge, okay? So even though it says apply key concepts of financial management, this is not really made clear in the learning outcome. Where it is made clear, it's in the associated assessment criteria. So in your associated assessment criteria for this particular learning outcome, you would break down what you mean by financial management concepts. So what are they? Okay? And what sort of analysis would they need to do? For what purpose? Okay, that's what would appear in the associated assessment criteria. So when you're writing learning outcomes, do remember to integrate the graduate attributes, the ways of being. Look at those very carefully. Those are up on Blackboard. Look at the level descriptors for your qualification. Most of you are at level 8. Some of you are doing masters, so they'll be at level 9. And Micah, yours is at level 5, so you'll be looking at the level descriptors there. But please, your level descriptors are not learning outcomes. Do not write out the level descriptors as if they are learning outcomes. They are not. They merely give the level at which students, level and complexity of application that students that is expected of the students in this qualification. And the other tip is also, when you're writing your learning outcomes for, particularly for a subject, perhaps not so much for the exit level outcomes of a program, but for a subject, try and scaffold those learning outcomes. So, you start off with perhaps the simpler learning outcomes and you build up towards the more complex learning outcomes for that subject. That, just a tip, quite often what happens, people write the most complex learning outcomes first, and then they end up writing the less complex ones, and it doesn't really make a lot of logical sense. But that's not, it's really just a coherence matter. It's not that, it's just a tip to follow. So, how do we go about writing learning outcomes? Well, again, in the last session, we looked at both the language that Biggs and Tang suggest that we use when writing these sorts of statements, when thinking about your teaching and learning strategy and your assessment strategies and these sorts of activities. But this is very much the language that you'll use in writing your learning outcomes and assessment criteria. We also talked about the different levels. Let's say level 5, a level 5 qualification. It's not going to be just about the student remembering or just about the student understanding, and then only when they get to levels 8 and 9 that they do more complex learning. No, not at all. All of these parameters of learning must be covered in all of the qualifications, but in different levels of complexity. Okay? So, you might want students, they might need to know how to do simple procedures, especially if it's a more practical type of subject that you're writing for, let's say like nursing or something where there's a lot of clinical work. There might be some simple procedures that need to do. And then you would use terminology like identify or perform the simple procedure of, okay, and then you explain it. But really, there should be very few learning outcomes around those kinds of very, very simple procedural demonstration of procedural knowledge. We really need to move on to more complex knowledge, so we can ask students to enumerate or list or describe or combine or do algorithms, okay? And that's the sort of simple application. But we want to move towards these two regions here, where students are using their knowledge in much more relational ways. So how to, especially if they're at level 8 where they're starting to do research, they have to be able to understand how knowledge links together. If this, then that, okay? And start to theorize and hypothesize. So moving from so here you're starting to link the particular together to start making general statements. And here you're starting to move very much more into the more generalization, the theorization, hypothesizing, reflecting. Okay? So you do want students to be able to compare, to be able to contrast, to be able to explain the causes, to analyze, to relate, to apply. And look at the language of learning outcomes that Biggs is suggesting, but also look at Bloom's. Bloom's has a very comprehensive anthology of the different terms that you can use for each of these levels of knowledge creation. So creating knowledge, what are the various verbs one can use? What are the various verbs one can use around evaluation and analysis and application, okay? All that terminology is there. Make yourself familiar with it. Use it in writing your learning outcomes. Okay, let's now see an example of a learning outcome and how you go about writing it. Remember, a learning outcome always starts with, by the end of this program or course, students will be able to. That is assumed. That is assumed how it will start off, okay? So your learning outcome always starts with a verb. By the end of this program or by the end of this course, students will be able to use. All right? It starts with a verb. Not demonstrate use of, just use. Okay? Now, we talked about the 3 domains, the cognitive, if you like, the knowledge, the knowing, the doing, and the being. Let's look at the knowing. Let's look at a learning outcome around the knowing, but the cognitive domain of Bloom's taxonomy. So, let's say it's an engineering qualification. Use sophisticated techniques for analyzing the efficiencies of energy usage in complex industrial processes. Learning outcomes must have a verb. They must start with a verb, the do, use. It should then encapsulate the subject content knowledge, the cognitive skills, the techniques, etc. What is that in this particular learning outcome? They must be able to use sophisticated techniques, not basic techniques, sophisticated techniques for analyzing the efficiencies of energy usage. So it's quite, a lot is encapsulated in this statement. It's a powerful statement. Sophisticated techniques for analyzing the efficiencies of energy usage. And the context in complex industrial processes, not simple industrial processes. Okay? So that is a very powerful statement. That would be more at an exit level outcome rather than a subject level outcome. All right, what would the assessment criteria look like for this learning outcome? Remember, your assessment criteria, there should always be more than one assessment criterion. Very, very rarely is there only one assessment criterion. If there is, it usually means that the learning outcome has not been well written. Okay? It should not, the assessment criterion should not be the same as the learning outcome. So, the assessment criteria could give more detail about the specific analysis techniques. So what sophisticated analysis techniques? Those could be listed in the assessment criteria. The assessment criteria could also indicate where these are to be performed. In other words, at the standard, just in the lab. Would they need to show how they are, how these techniques are used in the? Would they need to use workplace equipment? Or would it just need to be a case study? So let's say if it's a level 7 qualification, maybe a case study would be sufficient. A level 8 qualification might be lab and workplace. So just think about your qualification. How might you unpack these assessment criteria to show the standard at which the students are expected to perform? The AACs could also list how the results are to be recorded. So would they record the results in lab reports, and in what sort of format? Standard scientific format, professional body requirements? Again, this indicates the standard. You could unpack the sorts of energy efficiencies. So what do we mean by efficiencies of energy usage? Give more detail there. What parameters of complex industrial processes? So what kind of complex industrial processes? So you see how rich this learning outcome and these associated assessment criteria could be. You could break this down into a hugely rich area of learning. That's why I'm suggesting that this is for an exit level outcome. Just remember that your exit level outcomes and learning outcomes for a subject must address the cognitive, the psychomotor, and affective domains. Obviously, each one is not going to address all three, but you should have a mix of cognitive, psychomotor, and affective learning outcomes, okay? The knowing, the doing, and the being. Let's look at a learning outcome for the affective domain. Now, very seldom would you write one purely for the affective domain, okay? But you might. So, a learning outcome could be work cooperatively in a small group environment. That might be very suitable for, let's say, a level 6 or a level 7 qualification. The psychomotor domain, these skills: change a surgical dressing using an aseptic technique on a patient in a healthcare clinic. Very clear. Change. The nurse would need to change. What would she need to change? The surgical dressing using an aseptic technique. Just one aseptic technique, okay? And then presumably would need to explain that, and that will come out in the assessment criteria. And where on a patient in a healthcare clinic. All right, so this is at a healthcare clinic, primary healthcare. Very, very clearly circumscribed type of learning outcome. And again, your assessment criteria could unpack what do we mean by surgical dressing. There could be a number of different surgical dressings that they might need to use. There might be several different aseptic techniques. Okay, so, and there might be several different types of patient, kind of different types of trauma that need to be demonstrated. Okay, so think very clearly by the parameters. To what extent? What describe this learning in the learning outcome and the assessment criteria. Let's look at that learning outcome, the affective learning outcome, the learning outcome for the affective domain that I gave an example of there. And let's just see how that would, how we might describe the assessment criteria against 3 different levels, for a level 6 qualification, a level 7, and for a level 8. And this is aligned with the level descriptors. So if you take your level descriptors for these different levels and you look at how the assessment criteria are written, you'll see what I'm saying about all the time. Don't just take the level descriptor and write it. Apply it to your qualification. Apply it to your particular context. So let's say that the learning outcome is about working cooperatively. So for level 6, we could say work cooperatively in a small group environment. Whereas at level 8, we might say work cooperatively on work-related group projects. Work-related? So it's not just a little exercise you've been given in class, but it's a work-related. So it's probably authentic learning. It's probably a case study to do with a real-life scenario in a workplace. Okay, much higher level of complexity. So let's unpack the assessment criteria for level 6. Firstly, they need to collaborate cooperatively in problem solving related to small group activities. So we be very careful. Problem solving. Okay. What is this work cooperatively all about for level 6? Well, it's about problem solving. They're also going to need to, as part of a team, present the results to their peers. So in other words, they'd be doing classroom feedback. The team would work on a problem. They'd need to present it back to their class peers. And in that activity, they would need to take responsibility for their own work and that of other group members. Okay? So taking some responsibility for their own work, or take responsibility for their own work and that of other group members. So that's working collaboratively. Making sure that the others are also doing the work that they're supposed to do. All right? That's level 6. Quite well circumscribed. At level 7, we could say, all right, they need to collaborate cooperatively on investigatory group projects. So they're not just given a problem-solving task. They need to go and do a little bit of research, investigatory group projects. They've got a project they've got to go and discover for themselves, go and research more about it. As part of a team, present the results to a professional standard. All right, so maybe they've got to present the results to a body of examiners, some of whom are from the industry, who are going to come and assess them. As part of the working cooperatively, they need to take full responsibility for their own work and limited accountability for that of other group members. Now, if we look for level 6, they're only taking responsibility for group members in relation to problem-solving tasks, okay? Whereas this is taking some limited accountability for that of other group members, but in a much more complex task. All right? So, again, it's setting the standard. What do we expect at level 7 here? Level 8, we expect much more. This is your postgraduate diploma level, your bachelor honours level. They need to be able to take the lead in collaborating cooperatively, okay, on simulated or authentic work-related group projects. Okay? Simulated or authentic work, so really much more complex. They need to present the results as a professional team to a range of audiences, not just one audience, to a range of audiences, and they all need to be professional and proficient. Each member of the team needs to be professional and proficient. So not just to a professional standard. In other words, as I did in level 7, let's say there might be a certain way that they need to present the findings in a professional report. Here they need to be professionals in the way that they present to a range of audiences. So here, this is very much the effect of the values, the being, okay? Not just the doing, but the being, a professional team. And the being here too, taking full responsibility for their own work and for that of other team members. In other words, what you would be expected to, how you would be expected to perform in a real life environment in the workplace. You need to lead a team and you need to take responsibility for what the other team members do. The buck stops with you. So that is why these level descriptors need to be looked at very, very carefully. And if you follow these and you follow the complexity, you can come up with these kinds of associated assessment criteria, which is so clear to your students and very clear for you as to what is going to be expected on the course. Let's look at one that one of the participants on the short course last year did. For Advanced Diploma in Sport and Leisure Management. So this is a level 7 qualification. And one of the level outcomes that he came up with was identify, explain, and apply the principles of exercise physiology and technology. Quite complex. It's an exit level outcome. You can see. Identify, explain, and apply principles of exercise physiology and technology. All right? But to a context that informs sport and leisure or human performance in general, and use appropriate technology to assess performance. Now, this is a big, powerful statement, an exit level outcome. Associated assessment criteria could be prescribe a fitness training program for an individual or team based on an understanding of human anatomy and exercise physiology. Second one would be create a modified, so first one is prescribe a fitness training program. The second one, create a modified training program for a special population group, e.g. youth, women, elderly, or disabled. And then finally, use technology to perform various fitness and physiological tests required to assess sport or leisure performance. Now, I want you to note, please, every single outcome that is mentioned here appears in the associated assessment criteria. Each one of these criteria address the learning outcome directly. What I often see is learning outcomes that are very general and vague, and then a whole lot of assessment criteria that actually don't speak to the level, the learning outcome at all. Okay? Prescribe a fitness training program. Okay? Apply the principles of exercise, and it's all here. Okay? Make sure that everything that you have mentioned in the learning outcome is related to an associated assessment criterion. I want you to now look, just finally, the last thing we're going to do here is just look at the what we call the graduate outcomes for the Level 8 research project. So the research methods, what we call research training, and for the research project. I have put these up on Blackboard. We have, in the curriculum development unit, we came up with these. We designed these very, very carefully in 2018. They've been approved by the university, and these are the guidelines for the standard at which you write your learning outcomes for your research project, for the postgraduate diploma and for the bachelor honours. All right. I'm going to look at just one of them here, just take you through that. So this would be the exit level outcome for this particular subject. Plan, manage, and execute. So plan, manage, and execute, carry out, an integrated, inquiry-based research project in an area of specialization. Okay, this is in an area of specialization under supervision and according to stipulated timelines, culminating in a research report or portfolio of evidence. Okay, so whether it's a bachelor honours, which is more general, your research project is going to address some area of specialization. It's not going to be a totally general research project. But it will be under supervision, and there will be clear timelines, and it will culminate in a research report or portfolio of evidence. So this is not about a dissertation or a thesis. Very clearly delineating what is expected of your students to do this. Now, so all the learning outcomes are there. Go and have a look at them with their associated assessment criteria. But let's look at what we would at master's level call the proposal. Now, we're not calling it a proposal at level 8. We're calling it a plan. So the learning outcome for this would be prepare a plan for an integrated inquiry-based research project. You would now need to just rewrite this slightly to contextualize it for your program. All right. The assessment criteria should more or less encompass the following. With guidance from a lecturer or supervisor, identify an authentic practice-based research problem, or, in the case of a Bachelor Honours, select a conceptual or theoretical research topic and interrogate the problem or topic to establish a suitable and manageable focus for an integrated inquiry-based research project. In other words, they've got to identify a research-based problem. Okay? The next assessment criterion would be with guidance. Again, with guidance, these are not unsupervised. Formulate a clear and concise research problem statement relevant to the topic and field of study, following the steps of the proposal writing. With guidance, generate research questions, aims and objectives for the research project based on the criteria and guidelines relevant to the field of study. So they'll be provided with criteria and guidelines, all right? So you're going to need to do that. The next step would be propose appropriate research methods and techniques that are relevant to the discipline, to the field of study, and related fields of professional practice. So very much research methods that are relevant, such as qualitative, quantitative, mixed research methods, sampling techniques, generating primary and secondary data, basic data analysis, etc. So they need to be able to discuss those briefly. They need to propose those briefly, propose what would be appropriate to this research topic. And then finally, they need to prepare and present an integrated research project plan relevant to the topic and field of study in the form of, now, it could be a poster. It could be a written report or a proposal. It could be a presentation or a mix of these or some other form or forms deemed appropriate to the field and context of study. So do you see how wide open it is and yet how very much circumscribed it is? So these assessment criteria lay out very clearly for you in your context what your students could be expected to do. But it's got to be you've got to rewrite these and contextualize them within your particular project, within your field of study or your specialization or whatever it is. Okay, that's taken a long time to get through this quite short presentation, but I hope that's been clear enough. I've also posted up a recording of a presentation that I did last year for the short course. It's a little bit more expansive. It's not quite as directed as this one is, but it might be useful for you to listen to as well. Your next step, write up the exit level outcomes and associated assessment criteria for your qualification in collaboration with your colleagues, please. You can't do this on your own. Any questions? Please send them to me. I'll be happy to attend to them. Thank you.